I want to just say about a little over a week ago, the AFL-CIO gave Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva its Human Rights Award, and they recognized him for what he was, a president that brought tens of millions of people out of poverty, left the presidency with record approval ratings, and also was somebody that, because he was a poor, illiterate, self-made, until he was an adult, he learned to read, union organizer who lost fingers working in a factory, who helped end the military dictatorship in the 80s through his activism, and was a very, very successful social democratic president in the grand scheme of things, including especially what was possible in the years he governed from 2002 to 2010. So everybody, look, part of the reason I talk about Lula a lot is because he is this incredibly important figure, and because it is genuinely extraordinary and horrifying that you can put somebody in jail and wage a ruthless campaign against them and their political party and the democratic apparatus of the center left in Brazil with no material evidence is mind-boggling. Especially from my perspective, because, look, I'm a person of the world, and I have no doubt that while the charges against him of taking things like a apartment after he was president, which isn't even illegal anyways, and is pales in comparison to the speaking fees and consultancy. I mean, Tony Blair is hopping across the globe, making literally tens of millions of dollars advising dictators and oil funds and all the rest of it. And we're putting an incredible leader in jail for a economy middle class apartment on the beach that there isn't even any evidence in terms of writing or legal documents to connect him to. It's all based off of the testimony of somebody who pleaded out. So I think it's terrifying in and of itself, and I think it's a great wrong to a good person and a great leader. But I also think, especially as Brazil comes more alive in U.S. discourse, because all of a sudden people are sort of taken up by the horror show of Bolsonaro, who is just, he's like Trump. He's one of the worst people on planet Earth. And whether you're concerned about the environment or the Amazon or indigenous people or LGBTQ people, or you have a concern and understanding of labor and pensions, this is a relentless assault, not to mention the crisis that could be set off if they continue to instigate with Venezuela. So it's first that there is a context that gets Bolsonaro to power, and you can't understand it without understanding the totally illegitimate removal of Dilma Rousseff from power in 2016. You can't understand it without the jailing of Lula da Silva, who led Bolsonaro in the polls. Could you imagine if Lula was at the White House with Trump instead of Bolsonaro? No crisis in Venezuela. No Amazon on the chopping block. No clawed back protections for LGBTQ people. And I think that there is a certain type of person, and part of it is because of the just atrocious and unpardonable coverage from The Guardian and the New York Times and Vox and others. And I'm not saying, look, they're not in the opinion business. Of course, it's not their job and their reporter's job to say he's innocent, free him. But it is their job to say, to report the facts of the case instead of just repeating the pablum of the discredited Brazilian judiciary and Brazilian elites. There's no material evidence, and the person who put him in jail without any material evidence is the justice minister in this fantastically fascistic Bolsonaro government. So in any country, wouldn't it be an interesting story for the Times or the Guardian to report, the lead candidate, who was the former president, who was universally respected and regarded, was put in jail without any material evidence by an independent prosecutor backed by the United States, who then became the justice minister in a new far-right extremist government that has its own, already within a couple of months, infinitely more serious corruption allegations. Maybe that's just an interesting thing to write about. Maybe that's just worth looking at. And the last thing I'll say, too, if you want to have solidarity, if you go to the Brazilian left, and if you're on social media, obviously, upper-class Brazilians mostly, and people speaking English they're going to be part of the people who've been propagandized on this issue. But if you want actual solidarity with the left, they will tell you, we need to free Lula. This is part, if you want to be solidarity with us against Bolsonaro, you need to deal with this issue and not, bail on it because it's actually fundamental to understanding what's happening in Brazil and also the U.S. role of what's happening in Brazil. I don't know. I am increasingly convinced. I know that the DOJ backed Lava Jato. I know that U.S. foreign policy was moved towards reversing these pink-tide governments. I think it's quite bizarre Bolsonaro visited the CIA, and I am not convinced that the ongoing imprisonment of Lula and taking him off the board and delegitimization of the Workers' Party was not part of that conversation. This is a report from Michael Fox at the Real News Network, and I want to highlight this because this is the new social movement that's brewing in Brazil to free Lula. And these activists will tell you themselves that you cannot separate this broader struggle from that imprisonment.
Social movements and left political parties met in Sao Paulo over the weekend to relaunch the campaign to free former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
It's important to free Lula because he represents each and every one of us. He represents our victories. If he's in jail, each of us are in jail. It means our rights are going down the drain.
More than 1,000 people attended the event. At the meeting, they organized plans for a series of actions to coincide with the one-year anniversary of Lula's imprisonment on April 7th. Under Lula's presidency, millions were lifted out of poverty. He left office with an 87% approval rating. He's still one of the country's most popular leaders. But he was jailed last year after he was convicted of accepting a beachside apartment from a company seeking government contracts. Judges ruled against him in a second conviction earlier this year, involving this time a country property an hour north of Sao Paulo. But his supporters and many legal experts say he's innocent, and that the convictions were a means of blocking him from returning to power. They say Judge Sergio Moro was politically motivated. Moro has long held connections to the country's right wing. He's now President Jair Bolsonaro's justice minister.
We in the Brazilian Association of Lawyers for Democracy have been following this case for a long time, from the very beginning, with lawyers from across the country. And we consider both rulings against Lula to be complete judicial aberrations. There is no evidence against Lula.
So that's it. And it was great that the letter a couple of weeks ago that the group of Congress people sent out registering all their concerns about Bolsonaro's assault on Brazil at least included a paragraph on how the barring of Lula from the presidential elections, the most popular politician in the country, undermined democratic institutions. But this needs to become much more clear, much more aggressive, and much more robust. He is a political prisoner. And you cannot separate that from a broader concern set about Brazil.